On the morning of November 22nd, 1963, the United States believed it understood the world it lived in. The Cold War was dangerous but structured. The presidency carried authority, and the idea that truth would eventually emerge from evidence felt almost automatic. By the end of that day in Dallas, that assumption would be irreversibly damaged. President John F. Kennedy arrived in Texas as part of a politically calculated tour. The state was essential for the 1964 election, yet deeply divided. Anti-Kennedy sentiment was visible on the streets, in newspapers, and among local political figures. Despite warnings and internal concerns, the decision was made to proceed with a highly visible motorcade through downtown Dallas. The route was publicly announced in advance. The presidential limousine had no protective roof. Security was minimal by modern standards, but at the time this openness was seen as a sign of confidence rather than exposure. As the motorcade entered Dealey Plaza shortly after 12:30 p.m., it slowed dramatically to make a sharp turn beneath the Texas School Book Depository. Crowds lined the streets. Cameras were rolling. Children waved flags. In a matter of seconds, everything changed. Witnesses later described hearing a loud crack, followed by a pause, then more shots in quick succession. Some thought they were firecrackers. Others immediately recognized gunfire. President Kennedy clutched his throat, then collapsed backward as a final shot struck his head. Governor John Connally, seated in front of the president, was also gravely wounded. The Zapruder film captured the moment in brutal clarity. Shot by a local businessman using an 8mm camera, it recorded the assassination frame by frame. At the time, Zapruder believed he was simply filming a historic visit. Instead, he unintentionally created one of the most examined pieces of visual evidence in modern history. The film would later be slowed, enlarged, dissected, and debated endlessly, becoming both a record of truth and a source of confusion. In the immediate aftermath, Dealey Plaza dissolved into chaos. People ran in different directions, some toward the grassy knoll, others toward the book depository. Police officers responded to conflicting reports of gunfire from multiple locations. Radios crackled with uncertainty. No clear picture emerged, only fragments of perception layered over shock. Within 90 minutes, Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested. Initially detained for the murder of Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit, Oswald was soon charged with the assassination of the president. He was a former Marine, a self-described Marxist, and a man who had defected to the Soviet Union before returning to the United States. To authorities, he appeared to be a convenient answer to an impossible question. But Oswald denied the charges. He insisted he had been framed. "I'm just a patsy," he told reporters while being escorted through police headquarters. His interrogation lasted more than 12 hours, yet no full recordings or transcripts were made. Even in the most consequential criminal case in American history, the words of the accused were never preserved. 2 days later, before Oswald could stand trial, he was shot and killed by Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner with connections to organized crime and local police. Ruby's bullet ended any possibility of courtroom testimony, cross-examination, or a public defense. The killing was broadcast live across the nation. In that moment, the central figure in the case vanished, and with him, the chance for conventional justice. The government faced an immediate crisis. A president was dead. The accused assassin was dead. Public confidence was at risk. To restore order, President Lyndon B. Johnson established the Warren Commission. Its task was not only to investigate what happened, but to stabilize a shaken nation. When the commission released its findings in 1964, it delivered certainty. Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. 3 shots were fired from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. No evidence of conspiracy was found. The case was closed. Yet for many Americans, the story felt finished too quickly. The Commission's conclusions relied on technical explanations that clashed with intuition and eyewitness perception. The single bullet theory, which proposed that 1 bullet caused 7 wounds across 2 men, became a symbol of this disconnect. To experts, it was plausible. To the public, it felt forced. The language of ballistics and timing struggled to override what people believed they had seen and heard. The Zapruder film became the focal point of doubt. When viewed carefully, Kennedy's backward movement after the fatal shot appeared counterintuitive. While scientific explanations were offered, the image remained powerful. In a visual age, what people see often outweighs what they are told. Eyewitnesses who reported shots from the grassy knoll felt ignored or misrepresented. Some later recanted under pressure. Others maintained their accounts for decades. The gap between official certainty and personal memory widened. Even early on, questions emerged about missing evidence, destroyed notes, and secrecy surrounding the autopsy. Instead of resolving doubts, each unanswered question multiplied them. Trust, once weakened, did not recover. By the end of the 1960s, the assassination of John F. Kennedy was no longer just a crime. It had become a symbol of something deeper, the moment when Americans realized that truth could be filtered, delayed, or shaped by power. And this was only the beginning. To understand why the assassination of John F. Kennedy never settled into history, one must look beyond the moment of the shooting and examine the figures who stood at the center of the story. Chief among them was Lee Harvey Oswald, a man whose biography defied simple explanation and whose life intersected with the most sensitive fault lines of the Cold War. Oswald was not an ordinary drifter. As a young man, he joined the United States Marine Corps and served at bases connected to advanced radar systems. During this time, he developed a strong interest in Marxism and taught himself Russian to a level that surprised those who later encountered him. In 1959, at the height of Cold War tension, Oswald defected to the Soviet Union. Such defections were rare and closely monitored, yet Oswald was allowed to leave with little resistance. In the Soviet Union, Oswald lived openly, worked in a factory, married a Russian woman, and threatened suicide when initially denied citizenship. Eventually, he was permitted to stay. Less than 3 years later, he returned to the United States with his wife and child. Even more surprising was the ease of his return. Despite his defection, his apparent political radicalism, and his public renunciation of the United States, Oswald faced minimal consequences. To intelligence observers, this alone raised questions. Back in America, Oswald's behavior grew more contradictory. He distributed pro-Castro leaflets in New Orleans, yet his activities often intersected with known anti-Castro groups. He appeared in photographs with members of organizations connected to intelligence operations. He sought contact with the Soviet and Cuban embassies in Mexico City shortly before the assassination. Each of these actions could be interpreted as isolated or coincidental, but together they formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. The official investigation framed Oswald as a lone, unstable individual driven by ideology and resentment. But critics argued that his movements suggested something more complex. Whether he was an intelligence asset, a manipulated intermediary, or merely someone moving unknowingly within larger forces, remains unresolved. What is clear is that Oswald was not the simple caricature often presented in early accounts. His interrogation following the assassination deepened the mystery. Oswald was questioned for more than 12 hours over 2 days, yet no audio recordings or full transcripts exist. Notes were taken and later destroyed. Witnesses offered conflicting recollections of what Oswald said. In a case of unparalleled importance, the absence of a definitive record is striking. It left the public with second-hand summaries instead of primary evidence. Oswald's death ensured that these questions would never be answered in court. The man who killed him, Jack Ruby, quickly became the second enigmatic figure in the case. Ruby was a nightclub owner with ties to organized crime and a familiar presence around Dallas police headquarters. He had access, connections, and a temperament that made his actions difficult to categorize. Ruby claimed he shot Oswald out of grief and anger, stating that he wanted to spare Jacqueline Kennedy the pain of a trial. Yet his behavior before and after the shooting raised doubts. He had been seen near Dealey Plaza on the day of the assassination. He entered the police basement with ease at a moment when security should have been highest. After his arrest, Ruby made cryptic statements suggesting that the full truth would never be known. Medical and psychological evaluations of Ruby offered conflicting portraits. Some described him as emotionally unstable. Others noted his coherence and awareness. His sudden illness and death from cancer before a new trial only added to the sense of unfinished business. As with Oswald, the central witness was removed before deeper examination could occur. The broader context of the Cold War loomed over every aspect of the case. In 1963, the United States had narrowly avoided nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Intelligence agencies operated with extreme secrecy. Covert operations against Cuba and other perceived threats were widespread. In such an environment, the disclosure of sensitive failures or rogue actions carried enormous risk. This reality shaped the government's response. The priority was stability. Any suggestion that intelligence agencies had lost control, mishandled assets, or indirectly contributed to the assassination would have had profound consequences. Whether or not such failures occurred, the incentive to limit exposure was powerful. The Warren Commission itself operated under constraints. Commissioners later acknowledged that certain information was withheld or restricted. The assumption that Oswald acted alone simplified an otherwise uncontrollable narrative. It provided closure, even if that closure felt incomplete. As years passed, journalists, researchers, and former officials began to speak more openly. Some suggested that the truth was not a single grand conspiracy, but a convergence of errors, secrecy, and fear. Others believed that Oswald was part of a larger operation that was never fully acknowledged. The lack of transparency allowed both interpretations to thrive. By the time Congress reopened the investigation in the 1970s, public trust had already been damaged by Vietnam and Watergate. The House Select Committee on Assassinations reflected this changed atmosphere. Its conclusion that Kennedy was probably killed as part of a conspiracy validated long-held suspicions. yet it failed to provide definitive answers. Instead, it confirmed uncertainty. Oswald and Ruby became symbols rather than solutions. They represented the opaque intersection between individuals and institutions, where responsibility blurred and accountability dissolved. Their stories illustrated how easily truth could be obscured when power, secrecy, and fear converged. The assassination was no longer just about who pulled the trigger. It was about whether the full story could ever be told. And as Part 3 will show, the problem did not end with individuals. It extended into documents, institutions, and the long shadow of secrecy that followed for decades. As the years passed after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the focus slowly shifted from gunmen and witnesses to something less visible but far more powerful: documents, files, memos, photographs, recordings, and reports became the new battleground. What had once been a crime scene turned into an archive, and within that archive, silence itself became evidence. From the outset, information about the assassination was tightly controlled. Intelligence agencies, the military, and federal law enforcement each possessed pieces of the story, yet no single body held the complete picture. Much of what was gathered in the immediate aftermath was classified, not because it directly proved a conspiracy, but because it revealed methods, failures, and vulnerabilities. In the logic of the Cold War, exposure itself was dangerous. The Warren Commission relied heavily on information provided by the FBI and CIA. Commissioners later admitted that they accepted intelligence assessments largely on trust. Subsequent investigations revealed that key details about Oswald's contacts, surveillance, and movements had not been fully disclosed. This was not necessarily the result of a coordinated cover-up, but rather of institutional instinct. Agencies protected themselves first. The autopsy materials became an early symbol of this problem. Kennedy's body was removed from Dallas against the objections of local authorities, and the autopsy was conducted at Bethesda Naval Hospital under military supervision. Doctors later disagreed on what they observed. Notes were destroyed, photographs were withheld, X-rays were locked away. The president's brain, essential for determining bullet trajectory, went missing entirely. Each anomaly could be explained individually. Together, they formed a pattern of opacity. As public skepticism grew, so did demands for transparency. In the 1970s, amid a broader crisis of confidence triggered by Vietnam and Watergate, Congress reopened the investigation. The House Select Committee on Assassinations gained access to materials previously unseen by the Warren Commission. Its final report acknowledged the likelihood of a conspiracy, yet stopped short of identifying its nature or participants. Once again, the public was offered ambiguity instead of resolution. The release of classified files became a slow, frustrating process. Each wave of declassification promised answers, but delivered partial truths. Documents were released with heavy redactions. Others were delayed indefinitely. Some were discovered to have been destroyed long before they could be reviewed. The logic was always the same: national security, protection of sources, preservation of institutional integrity. In 1992, public pressure forced the passage of the JFK Records Act, mandating the release of assassination-related documents. The law was a response not only to historical curiosity, but to decades of mistrust. It acknowledged, implicitly, that secrecy itself had become part of the problem. Millions of pages were eventually released, yet even then, full disclosure remained elusive. Each new document added context, but rarely closure. Files revealed that Oswald had been monitored more closely than previously admitted. Intelligence agencies had tracked his activities abroad. Warnings had been missed. Assumptions had been made. None of this conclusively proved a conspiracy, but it exposed a system riddled with blind spots and internal contradictions. The persistence of secrecy had a cumulative effect. For many Americans, the continued withholding of information became more suspicious than any single theory. If there was nothing to hide, why hide it for so long? This question echoed through generations, shaping how later events were interpreted. The assassination became a reference point, a case study in how truth could be delayed until it lost its power. Media played a crucial role in sustaining the mystery. Journalists, filmmakers, and authors filled the gaps left by official silence. Some approached the subject with rigor, others with speculation. The line between investigation and imagination blurred. In the absence of definitive answers, narratives multiplied. Each new theory reflected not only the evidence, but the anxieties of the era in which it emerged. The government's reluctance to fully resolve the case had unintended consequences. It created a culture of doubt that extended far beyond Dallas. Subsequent revelations about covert operations, surveillance programs, and misinformation campaigns reinforced the belief that institutions were capable of deception. The Kennedy assassination became the origin story for modern skepticism. Yet it is important to understand that secrecy does not always indicate guilt. Large institutions often conceal information to protect reputations, avoid accountability, or prevent embarrassment. In the context of the Cold War, admitting failure could carry enormous strategic costs. The possibility that the truth was fragmented, inconvenient, and politically dangerous may explain the silence better than any single conspiracy. Still, the effect was the same. Without transparency, trust could not be restored. Each withheld document became a symbol of unresolved history. Each delay reinforced the sense that the public was being kept at a distance from its own past. By the time the 21st century arrived, the assassination of John F. Kennedy had become less about forensic detail and more about institutional memory. It was no longer a question of who fired which shot, but of how power manages uncertainty. The case demonstrated how easily narratives could harden into doctrine, and how difficult it was to revisit them once they served a political purpose. The story had evolved into something larger than itself. It had become a lesson in how democracies handle trauma, fear, and the temptation to prioritize stability over truth. And yet, one final question remained unanswered. Why, after all these years, does this case still matter? That question defines the final part. More than 6 decades after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the question persists, not because of a single missing document or an unresolved technical detail, but because the event altered how modern societies relate to truth itself. The case endures as a reminder that facts alone do not create understanding. Trust does. And once trust is damaged, even the most thorough explanation can feel insufficient. Before Dallas, Americans largely believed that national tragedies, though painful, would eventually be clarified through institutions. The assumption was simple. Evidence would be gathered, responsibility assigned, and history would move forward. The assassination disrupted that expectation. It demonstrated that official conclusions could arrive quickly, yet still fail to convince. That gap between authority and belief became the defining legacy of the case. The importance of the Kennedy assassination lies not only in what may have happened, but in how the response unfolded. Decisions made in the name of stability shape the narrative more than the evidence itself. By prioritizing closure over transparency, institutions unintentionally created a vacuum that speculation rushed to fill. Once that vacuum existed, it could never be fully sealed. This dynamic reshaped public consciousness. Citizens learned to question not only individual claims, but the systems that produced them. Later scandals reinforced this lesson. Vietnam exposed the manipulation of information. Watergate confirmed that high-level deception was possible. Intelligence disclosures revealed a hidden architecture of surveillance and covert action. Each event echoed the same underlying realization first felt in 1963. Authority did not guarantee truth. The assassination also transformed the role of media. Images from Dealey Plaza, especially the Zapruder film, became symbols of contradiction. They showed how visual evidence could challenge official narratives without resolving them. The public learned that seeing was not the same as understanding, and that interpretation could be as powerful as fact. In this sense, the Kennedy assassination anticipated the modern information age, where competing narratives coexist and certainty is elusive. Culturally, the case became a shared reference point. It appeared in films, literature, and political discourse. It shaped how generations thought about power, secrecy, and vulnerability. Even those who accepted the lone gunman conclusion often acknowledged discomfort with how the investigation was conducted. Doubt did not require belief in conspiracy. It required only the recognition that something felt unresolved. Importantly, the endurance of the case does not necessarily imply a single hidden truth waiting to be uncovered. It may instead reflect a more unsettling reality, that the truth itself is fragmented, that no single institution ever possessed a complete picture, that errors, omissions, and fear combined to produce an explanation that was technically defensible, but emotionally unsatisfying. In such a scenario, secrecy becomes not a mask for guilt, but a barrier to healing. The continued release of documents has reinforced this ambiguity. Each disclosure adds context, not closure. Files reveal missed warnings, misjudgments, and internal contradictions. They show a system struggling to understand itself in real time. What they do not provide is a clean resolution, and perhaps that is the final lesson. The assassination of John F. Kennedy matters because it reveals the limits of certainty in complex systems. It shows how truth can be constrained by politics, fear, and institutional self-preservation. It demonstrates that history is not only written by evidence, but shaped by what is withheld, delayed, or forgotten. In the end, the case remains open not in courtrooms, but in collective memory. It persists because it asks a question that has no easy answer. How much truth can a society tolerate in moments of crisis? The response to Kennedy's death suggests that when the answer is not all of it, the cost is long-term mistrust. Dealey Plaza has become a symbol not of a solved crime, but of an unresolved relationship between citizens and power. The shots that echoed there did more than end a life. They initiated an era in which skepticism became rational, doubt became inherited, and belief required more than official assurance. History did not end on November 22nd, 1963, but something essential changed, and that change continues to shape how the modern world listens, questions, and remembers.